Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night trip into the dim, candle-lit corridors of history, where everyone smells faintly of bread, nobody smiles in portraits, and every rule seems to have been written by someone who just hit their head on a stone wall. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle in under your blanket, maybe grab some tea that tastes like twigs and regret, and let's drift gently back to a time when life was short. The plague was casual, and people genuinely believed that bathing too often could kill you. Tonight, we're exploring weird medieval rules. Not the fun kind, like don't joust before breakfast, but the ones that actually shaped everyday life. The laws, customs, and religious mandates that sound absurd to us now, but in their own strange medieval logic, actually made sense, at least. Kind of. Thou shalt not bathe too much. Let's start with one of the classics, the medieval aversion to bathing. You've probably heard the myth, people in the Middle Ages never bathed, which isn't entirely true, but also not entirely false. Here's the deal. In early medieval Europe, public bathhouses were surprisingly common. They were hangouts, like an awkward, steamy combination of a spa, a pub, and a gossip circle. But by the late 14th century, things took a turn. Bathhouses started being associated with sin, lust, and public health nightmares. Because of course they were. After the Black Death rolled through in the 1340s, killing roughly 1/3 of Europe, people started thinking maybe, just maybe, all that communal nakedness in warm water wasn't helping. Doctors, who mostly operated on the sounds vaguely plausible school of medicine, began warning that hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease. Essentially, if you were clean, you were doomed. So people stopped bathing frequently, not because they didn't care about hygiene, but because they were trying to survive. Instead, they embraced the medieval solution to every problem: layers. Lots and lots of layers. They believed linen undergarments drew out impurities from the skin. So instead of washing themselves, they washed their shirts. And congratulations, your laundry just replaced your bathtub. Of course, this led to a charming situation where nobles might change their underclothes daily, and peasants maybe once a month. If the weather was nice. It sounds horrifying, but within their worldview it was perfectly reasonable. Disease spread mysteriously. Steam and pores looked suspiciously connected. And besides, if you were a noble in the 14th century, your biggest daily struggle wasn't smell management. It was avoiding being stabbed by your cousin for your estate. Priorities: meatless Fridays and the holy fish economy. Next up, a rule that sounds more like a medieval dietary fad than divine mandate: no meat on Fridays, or during Lent or Advent, or certain feast days. Basically, if it was a day ending in day, there was a fair chance your local priest was side-eyeing your mutton stew. The church had a lot to say about what people could eat, and when. The logic behind it wasn't random. It was a mix of religious discipline and economic strategy. Abstaining from meat was meant to be a spiritual exercise, a reminder of humility and self-denial. But conveniently, it also created a booming market for fish. Entire fishing industries from England to the Baltic thrived on the church's dietary rules. Even landlocked towns had to find ways to import salted herring or dried cod, which led to huge trade networks and eventually some impressive medieval cold chain logistics. Kings and nobles leaned into it too. By the 13th century, royal kitchens had elaborate fish days menus with up to 30 different species of fish, eels, shellfish, and river critters. Because if you're going to fast, you might as well do it with variety. The irony, of course, is that fasting became a gourmet experience. A monk in a French abbey might have technically been abstaining from meat, but he was also eating buttery carp, almond tarts, and mulled wine. Repentance, but make it luxurious. Don't trust your onions after dark. One of my favorite obscure rules comes from medieval domestic law. The belief that you should never, ever leave cut onions out overnight, because apparently onions absorb evil. Seriously. Medieval household guides warned that sliced onions left unattended could draw in sickness or even absorb malicious vapors. Basically, your pantry could turn demonic if you weren't careful. Now, this sounds ridiculous, but again there's a practical reason buried under the superstition. In the days before refrigeration, a cut onion sitting out could easily pick up bacteria or rot overnight. People noticed that old onions sometimes made them sick, so they invented a spiritual reason not to eat them. Boom. Instant food safety protocol. It's the same logic that gave rise to rules like don't leave bread uncovered, so mice don't find it, or don't whistle indoors, so spirits might or thieves don't hear you. Medieval life was filled with that kind of magical thinking, morality and microbiology, hopelessly intertwined. The King's Touch, Medieval Healthcare, Deluxe Edition. Let's float over to another royal rule, one that combined politics, faith, and wishful thinking. The divine healing powers of kings. From France to England, monarchs were believed to have the ability to cure certain diseases, especially scrofula, a nasty tubercular swelling of the lymph nodes, often called the king's evil. The treatment, a gentle touch from the king himself. The idea dated back to the early Middle Ages, when kings needed every ounce of legitimacy they could get. If your divine right to rule was a little shaky, nothing said chosen by God quite like healing a few hundred peasants with a tap on the forehead. The ritual was elaborate. The king would wash his hands, cross himself, and then touch the afflicted one by one, murmuring blessings. Sometimes he'd hand out a special coin afterward, a touch piece as a holy souvenir. And you might think surely people didn't believe that worked, but they absolutely did. Some sufferers claimed miraculous recovery, probably due to a combination of placebo, fresh air, and the sheer adrenaline of being touched by royalty. Even Charles II of England, reigning in the 1600s, kept the tradition alive, reportedly touching over 90,000 people during his reign. Which, given that Charles wasn't exactly known for restraint in any department, sounds about right. Of course, modern historians look back and shake their heads, but it wasn't pure delusion. It was about creating a sense of connection between ruler and subject, heaven and earth, rich and poor. A kind of political performance art, with mild tuberculosis on the side. No fighting in churches, so they built more churches. Now, if you were a medieval lord, you probably had one main hobby, arguing violently about land. Unfortunately, this often involved your neighbor, your cousin, or a passing monk who made the mistake of owning a fence. So, in the 10th and 11th centuries, the church decided to intervene with a movement called the Peace and Truce of God. Basically, the church started laying down rules for when and where people were allowed to fight. You couldn't fight near churches. You couldn't fight on holy days. You couldn't fight during Lent, Advent, or Sundays. At one point, that left maybe 3 available days in the entire calendar. The rule was practical, sort of. It was meant to reduce endless cycles of local violence that disrupted trade and pilgrimage. But the side effect was that nobles started building more churches, strategically, so their enemies had fewer legal places to attack them. You can almost picture it. Ah, you can't burn my village today, Geoffrey. It's too close to the new chapel I built last week. Better luck after Easter. And somehow that's how parts of France ended up with entire valleys full of tiny chapels, all built less out of devotion and more as medieval loopholes. So you've survived the no bathing rule. You've eaten your fish on Fridays. You've avoided the cursed onions. Congratulations. You're officially ready to live, dine, and possibly perish in medieval Europe without causing a scandal. Because in a world where almost everything was seen as a reflection of your moral state, there were rules for everything. How you dressed, how you sneezed, how you looked at cheese, all of it mattered. And somehow, the logic always came back to religion, class, or the ongoing fear that your neighbor's weird new hat might be the first sign of the apocalypse. How to eat like a respectable human, or at least try. Let's start at the dinner table, the beating heart of medieval etiquette, and arguably one of the few moments of joy people got between plagues. Now, when you imagine medieval dining, you might picture greasy turkey legs, wild laughter, and flagons of ale being thrown across the hall. And sure, that did happen, but there were also rules. Lots of them. For one thing, forks were basically unknown in Western Europe until the 11th or 12th century, and even then, most people found them scandalous. When a Byzantine princess introduced the fork to Venice, clergymen were horrified. They saw it as decadent, even sinful, because God gave you fingers, so use them. You know, solid theological reasoning. So meals were eaten mostly by hand, but in an organized way. Each person got a piece of thick bread called a trencher, which served as both plate and napkin. You were expected to share that bread plate with your dining partner, because nothing says civilized society like passing your half-chewed crumbs to someone else. And while this all sounds filthy, medieval people actually obsessed over manners. Table etiquette manuals were a real genre, thick books filled with commands like, do not blow your nose on the tablecloth, do not lick your knife, do not throw bones under the table, lest dogs disturb the company. The logic was less about hygiene and more about status. Clean hands and quiet chewing meant self-control, the ultimate Christian virtue. The louder or messier you were, the more animal-like you appeared. And being animal-like was basically the medieval version of being cancelled. Of course, in noble households, hypocrisy reigned supreme. A baron might gently dab his mouth with a linen napkin, right before demanding someone be whipped for serving the wrong temperature wine. Because civilization is all about balance. You are what you wear, literally. Next, let's talk about sumptuary laws. The wonderfully medieval idea that the government should tell you what you're allowed to wear, based on how rich or pious you're supposed to be. From the 13th century onward, almost every kingdom in Europe had some version of these rules. In England, you couldn't wear velvet or ermine unless you were nobility. In Florence, even merchants' wives were forbidden from wearing more than one gold ring at a time. In France, a servant could get fined for daring to wear silk. Why? Because society was obsessed with order. Everyone had a place and ordained by God, and clothing was a visual reminder of that. If peasants started dressing like nobles, the entire moral fabric of Christendom might collapse. At least that was the fear. The real reason was probably just envy and control. Kings didn't want rich merchants looking richer than they did. Ironically, the more these laws were passed, the more people tried to break them. The rich middle classes in cities like Venice or Bruges would find creative loopholes. Oh, this isn't velvet, it's imported goat fiber, totally legal. Some tailors even specialized in disguising forbidden fabrics by weaving cheaper threads into them, medieval counterfeit couture. The logic wasn't completely insane, though. By limiting who could flaunt luxury, these rules helped preserve scarce resources and prevent class riots. And let's be honest, medieval people loved judging each other. These laws just made it official. Marriage rules, the medieval family tree or circle. Now, let's float gently into the romantic swamp that was medieval marriage law. The church had very strong opinions about who could marry whom. And by strong, I mean impossibly complicated. In early medieval Europe, the church banned marriages between people up to 7 degrees of kinship apart, which, for reference, meant you basically couldn't marry anyone in your extended village without doing a genealogy chart that would make a monk cry. This rule was meant to prevent incest, but since most small communities were tightly knit, it mostly prevented marriage, period. So over time the church loosened it a bit, but noble families found ways around it. Royal marriages were political tools, not moral ones. If a king needed to marry his cousin to secure an alliance, he simply asked for a papal dispensation, and conveniently, popes loved giving those out to people who could afford donations. The result? Family trees that looked less like branches and more like tangled vines. By the late Middle Ages, European dynasties had successfully created the world's most expensive genetic experiment. But again, there was logic behind it. Marrying within familiar circles kept property intact, and alliances predictable. And for commoners, marriage rules helped control inheritance disputes. Love had nothing to do with it. Marriage was about stability, and stability was survival. Of course, that didn't stop anyone from writing poetry about tragic, forbidden love. It just meant they'd probably still marry their cousin afterward. How to die correctly. Let's talk about one of the most comforting medieval obsessions: dying properly. Death was everywhere. If you made it past childhood, war, famine, and the occasional stabbing over sheep rights, you still had the plague to look forward to. So people got really good at preparing for death, spiritually, socially, and even aesthetically. There were rules for dying well, known as ars moriendi, the art of dying. It wasn't about fighting death, but about doing it gracefully. You were supposed to confess, forgive your enemies, arrange your estate, and avoid despair, because apparently even dying sad was a sin. Priests circulated little guidebooks explaining how to die correctly. They listed temptations that might strike in your final hours: pride, impatience, lack of faith, and offered responses. Think of it like a medieval customer service manual for your soul. Even funerals were rule-driven. Poor people couldn't afford lavish burials, but they could join chantry guilds, groups that paid priests to pray for their souls after death. The idea was that enough prayers could shave time off your stay in purgatory. It was bureaucratic salvation, basically. The afterlife had paperwork, and just like everything else, the wealthy gamed the system. Some nobles arranged for dozens of priests to chant non-stop for their souls, like celestial customer loyalty programs. The poor just had to hope someone remembered them. Still, it was all rooted in a kind of earnest practicality. If life was unpredictable, at least death could be orderly. You couldn't control the world, but you could control how you exited it. The trial of the chicken and other legal wonders. Now for something completely medieval, putting animals on trial. Yes, actual legal trials, with judges, witnesses, and sometimes defense lawyers. If an animal killed someone, trampled crops, or just seemed possessed, it could be brought to court. Pigs were the most common offenders. They roamed freely in villages, sometimes got aggressive and, unfortunately, sometimes killed children. In such cases, the pig would be arrested, dressed in human clothes, and tried for murder. If found guilty, it could be executed publicly. There were also ecclesiastical trials for pests. In the 15th century, French priests literally summoned swarms of locusts or rats to court, ordering them to vacate church lands under penalty of excommunication. The logic was flawless. If sin caused misfortune, then obviously animals were moral agents too. It sounds ridiculous, but it was their way of restoring order, giving the illusion that justice existed, even when chaos ruled. Plus, it probably made people feel better to see someone, even a chicken, held accountable for the random horrors of nature. Welcome back, night travelers. The candle's still flickering. The rain outside hasn't stopped for about 600 years, and somewhere in a castle kitchen, a servant is still nervously trying to figure out which spoon won't get him excommunicated. We're continuing our slow meander through the strange world of medieval rules, the kind that sound absurd now, but back then were dead serious. Because when you live in an age of plagues, wars, and popes, who occasionally declare comets to be divine text messages, you cling to whatever structure you can, even if that structure involves, say, ringing a bell every 15 minutes to keep the devil from sneaking up on you. When the bells ruled the world, if you lived in a medieval town, you didn't own a clock. You didn't need one, because the church had already scheduled your entire day down to the minute using bells. The sound of bells wasn't just background noise, it was time itself. They rang for morning prayers, for work, for meals, for evening curfew, and because medieval people loved structure, for about 300 other things. Monks in monasteries had it even worse. Their lives were dictated by the canonical hours, 8 rounds of prayer spread evenly through the day and night. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. If you're wondering why monks always looked tired in paintings, that's why. The bells weren't just about timekeeping, though. They were also spiritual defense systems. People believed the sound of a church bell could literally drive away demons, storms, and plague. During thunderstorms, churches would ring their biggest bells to dispel the evil air. Never mind that those bells were often mounted on tall metal towers during lightning. What could go wrong? In France, bell founders even inscribed protective charms and Latin prayers onto the bells themselves. Each one had a name, a baptism, and a blessing ceremony. Essentially, every town had a few giant, extremely loud holy bodyguards hanging overhead. It's weirdly poetic, though, the idea that sound itself could keep the world in order. Every clang was a reminder, you're still alive. You still have a schedule. The world hasn't ended yet, which for the Middle Ages was honestly the best reassurance you could hope for. Taylor, beware the afterlife. Let's float over to another rule that stitched itself deep into medieval daily life: the guild system. Every profession had its guild: bakers, smiths, masons, cobblers, even candle makers. These weren't just trade unions. They were half business, half religious brotherhoods. Joining a guild meant more than just getting a job. It meant pledging your soul. You swore oaths, attended feast days, and promised to treat your craft as a moral duty. Because in the medieval mind, work wasn't just labor. It was divine purpose. But guilds had rules for everything. You couldn't make shoes on Sundays. You couldn't sell bread underweight. You couldn't open a rival workshop next door, unless you wanted the medieval version of a cease and desist, which usually involved angry men with hammers. The logic was practical. Guilds controlled quality, prices, and apprenticeships. They kept the economy from collapsing into chaos, but they also acted like social safety nets. If you got sick or your house burned down, your guild helped cover you. If you died, they arranged your funeral and prayed for your soul. And of course, they threw parties. Massive feast days where entire trades would march through the streets with banners and drums, usually slightly drunk and extremely proud. Because if you're going to spend your life making barrels or buttons, you might as well have one day where everyone claps for it. In a way, the guilds were medieval versions of LinkedIn. If LinkedIn involved more candles and fewer motivational posts, the 40-hour work week but make it holy. People often imagine medieval life as endless toil, and it was in many ways. But ironically, most medieval peasants had more holidays than modern workers. Between Sundays, Feast days, saints' days, and random holy days of obligation, many people in Catholic Europe got around 1 day off in every 3 or 4. Not bad for a society without air conditioning. Of course, day off didn't mean lounging in bed watching Netflix. It usually meant going to Mass, fasting, or walking 5 miles barefoot to a shrine. Still, a break was a break. The Church's endless calendar of holy days gave rhythm to the year. There was Lent for repentance, Easter for joy, harvest festivals for gratitude. Life wasn't one endless grind. It was a sacred cycle, and this rhythm was crucial for survival. It prevented overwork, structured agriculture, and kept communities synchronized. It wasn't so much rest as it was religiously mandated pacing. Imagine trying to explain that to your boss today. Sorry, I can't finish the report. It's St. Eligius Day, patron of blacksmiths. Divine union cause. Honestly, tempting. The rule of salt, preserving both meat and morality. If you ever want to understand the Middle Ages, just follow the salt. Salt wasn't just a condiment. It was power, wealth, and purity all in one. It preserved food, symbolized wisdom, and even had spiritual value. You couldn't consecrate holy water without salt. You couldn't host a noble feast without it. So naturally, there were rules. Servants had to place the salt cellar, the fancy bowl of salt, in the exact center of the table. Guests seated above the salt were high status. Those below were not. Yes, even your seating arrangement was a public ranking system. Breaking salt, spilling salt, or using it carelessly was considered bad luck, a waste of purity. It's where we get the superstition about throwing salt over your left shoulder. The medieval logic, if the devil was standing behind you, which apparently he always was, the salt might blind him. Salt taxes were also serious business. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax, became so hated that it helped spark the French Revolution centuries later. Which means technically, you can thank table seasoning for the collapse of the monarchy. But back in medieval times, salt laws were meant to keep life possible. Salt preserved meat through long winters, fed livestock, and kept armies supplied. No salt, no civilization. It was literally the difference between famine and feast, purity and decay. So yes, medieval people might have worshipped salt a little, but when your pantry doubles as your apocalypse bunker, it makes sense. Night curfews and the fear of the dark. Imagine it's 11 p.m. in a 14th century village. The streets are silent. The air smells like smoke and damp earth. And suddenly the church bell tolls one last time. The curfew. The word itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When you heard the bell, you were expected to extinguish your hearth and go to bed. Not because anyone was worried about bedtime productivity, but because medieval houses were basically kindling waiting to happen. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, open flames. You get the picture. So towns enforced strict fire curfews to prevent night disasters. If your chimney was still smoking after curfew, the local watchman might fine you, or worse, confiscate your fire tools. But there was another layer to it. People genuinely feared the night. Not just thieves, but spirits, demons, and night air, thought to cause sickness. Darkness was when the world of the living thinned, when bad things crossed over. So curfews weren't just civic policies. They were spiritual shields, closing the door between worlds. And, let's be honest, when you live in a time without streetlights or Netflix, sleep was the only entertainment option left anyway. Last one for tonight, a small, tender rule that somehow survived all the madness, the daily blessing of bread. In almost every medieval household, breaking bread wasn't just eating, it was a ritual. Before cutting the first loaf, people would make the sign of the cross over it. Sometimes they'd even mark the dough before baking, pressing a cross into it with a knife. The reasoning was simple. Bread was life, and life came from God. You didn't eat casually. You participated in a sacred cycle of giving thanks. This wasn't limited to fancy meals either. Even peasants on dusty fields would pause, bow their heads and mutter a quiet blessing over their crust. Bread connected everyone, kings, monks, beggars, in a shared rule of gratitude. And like so many medieval customs, it carried both a spiritual and practical weight. It slowed people down, turned eating into mindfulness before mindfulness existed, and maybe in a time of endless uncertainty, that tiny pause was the closest thing to peace most people had. Welcome back, weary traveler. We're still in the Middle Ages, a place where theology met bureaucracy, and both promptly lost the plot. The torches are flickering, the monks are mumbling, and somewhere a local official is trying to decide if wearing a green hat counts as a mortal sin, because yes, even color came with moral baggage. So did laughter and dancing, and for reasons no one can adequately explain, the direction you sneezed in. Let's glide through a few more of these beautifully absurd systems of order, the kind that only a deeply nervous civilization could invent. The color police are watching. Let's start with something that feels almost modern, the obsession with color coding. In the medieval mind, color wasn't just decoration. It was moral, social, and occasionally criminal. Take purple, for example, the ultimate royal color. It came from a dye made using thousands of tiny sea snails, which was so expensive that a single cloak could cost more than a farm. So naturally, kings declared it off limits. Only royalty could wear purple, because God apparently liked color coordination. In England, blue was reserved for nobles, scarlet for high officials, and brown or grey for the rest of you peasant-adjacent folk. Bright colours meant wealth. Drab colours meant humility. So if you were poor and wore yellow satin, congratulations, you just committed a fashion-based sin. Even religious orders had strict palettes. Franciscans wore brown, poverty. Dominicans wore black and white, purity and truth. Carthusians wore plain white, mostly because talking was forbidden and they didn't have time to argue about fashion anyway. But behind the vanity, there was logic. Colors acted like uniforms, visual shortcuts in a world without ID cards or surnames. You could tell someone's class, trade, and allegiance at a glance. It was social order, made wearable, and while that sounds controlling, remember, in a world full of wars and plagues, stability was sexy. If knowing who was above the salt kept things predictable, everyone could sleep a little better. Well, except the weavers, who were probably up all night trying to make legal shades of red. Thou shalt dance, but not too much. Let's float over to one of my favorite medieval paradoxes. The church loved dancing, until it didn't. In early medieval Europe, dancing was part of every celebration, weddings, harvests, saints' days. Villages danced in circles, holding hands, singing hymns. It was joyous. That was communal. It was terrifying to theologians. By the 13th century, church councils were repeatedly banning unseemly dancing near churches, especially mixed-gender ones, because apparently nothing invited moral decay faster than rhythm. There was even a thing called the dance mania, or St. Vitus's dance. Outbreaks where hundreds of people would dance uncontrollably in the streets for hours or days, until they collapsed. No one really knows what caused it. Mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, or maybe just the medieval equivalent of an outdoor rave gone wrong. Either way, it reinforced the idea that dance was dangerous, a gateway to chaos, so rules emerged. You could dance at weddings, but only to certain songs. You could dance in festivals, but not near the altar. And for God's sake, don't look too happy while doing it. Ironically, the church itself still used dancing metaphors in sermons. comparing heavenly joy to the eternal dance of angels. So, in theory, you could dance forever in heaven, just not at your cousin's barn party, when laughing too hard was a sin. In medieval Europe, laughter had a reputation problem. It wasn't that people never laughed. They did. Taverns were rowdy, plays were filthy, and people loved slapstick humor. But the official position of the church was deeply suspicious. Excessive laughter was considered a sign of pride or even madness. Saint Benedict's famous rule for monks literally banned loud or excessive laughter, calling it the sound of foolishness. The logic was simple. The more you laughed, the less you were thinking about your sins. Monks were expected to smile politely. At best, the medieval version of "please keep your voice down." Even some nobles were scolded for laughing at feasts. It was considered undignified. After all, how could you meditate on death if you were giggling about fart jokes? The irony, of course, is that medieval literature was full of humor. Chaucer, Boccaccio, and even early church plays were packed with innuendo and wordplay. It was just sanctioned laughter, carefully contained. It's a bit like the medieval emotional thermostat. Too little joy, and you risked despair. Too much joy, and you risked damnation. So everyone aimed for a safe middle ground smirk. Spiritual neutrality, with a hint of irony. Rules for weathering the weather. One of the strangest and most charming things about medieval Europe was the way people tried to regulate nature. When it rained too much, priests held rogation processions, walking around fields blessing crops and asking God to please chill. If there was a drought, people paraded relics through town to coax the skies open. And if a storm hit, bells were rung again to scare away lightning. But sometimes the church got more proactive. In parts of Germany and France, there were official weather priests, clergy whose whole job was to counter curses, calm storms, or occasionally excommunicate hail. Yes, hail. Records show bishops literally reading exorcisms over fields, commanding clouds to depart peacefully. And if the weather didn't listen, they'd hold a trial for the storm which is believed to have summoned it. Behind all the superstition, though, there's a kind of logic. Weather was life or death. No harvest meant starvation. If nature was unpredictable, then ritual gave people agency, the illusion of control in a chaotic world. In modern terms, they were basically doing medieval meteorology, just with more incense and less data. The calendar that forgot what year it was. Let's talk about time again, because medieval people were obsessed with it. They lived in a world of shifting calendars. Different regions started the new year on different days, March 25th, January 1st, or even Christmas. So, two towns a few miles apart might literally be living in different years. It got worse with feast days. The liturgical calendar ran on lunar cycles, while civic time followed the sun. So Easter moved every year. Lent started unpredictably, and no one could remember when anything happened. To cope, medieval scribes developed complex charts, Easter tables, moon cycles, saints' anniversaries, all hand-copied, often wrong and treated like divine Sudoku. You didn't just know the date, you interpreted it. And when Pope Gregory XIII finally reformed the calendar in 1582, people were outraged. They thought the church had literally stolen days from their lives. Which, to be fair, it kinda did. 10 of them gone overnight. But the old medieval system, messy as it was, had heart. Time wasn't just a measurement. It was sacred rhythm. Every day was part of a celestial loop. Saints, stars, and seasons weaving together in divine confusion. How to sin the right way. Finally, let's end tonight's section with one of the most medieval ideas of all, that sin could be organized, quantified and legally managed. Medieval confession wasn't just about guilt, It was about accounting. Every sin had a corresponding punishment, a kind of spiritual fine. Lie, that's 3 days of fasting. Steal a chicken? 7 days. Steal a horse? That's a whole pilgrimage, good luck. Priests kept penitentials, massive handbooks listing sins and their tariffs. It was moral bookkeeping at its finest, and once again it wasn't purely silly. This system helped standardize forgiveness, reduce arbitrary punishments, and bring personal reflection into daily life. It turned chaos into order, and sin into something you could manage like taxes, because in the end the Middle Ages weren't about ignorance, they were about control. Finding rules, rituals, and patterns that made life, however brutal, feel structured. And maybe if you followed enough of them, you'd tip the scales just enough to get to heaven. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've officially survived 4 parts of medieval absurdity. If you've drifted off already, honestly, that's kind of the point. But if you're still with me, tonight we'll tiptoe into the quieter corners of medieval life, where etiquette ruled like a second religion, and personal space simply wasn't invented yet. Because medieval people weren't just serious about salvation, they were also deeply, almost pathologically, serious about manners. And that meant rules. Rules for eating, rules for sleeping, rules for how to sneeze without offending the Virgin Mary. Table manners, but make it holy. So, picture a medieval dinner. There's no fork yet. Those are still considered suspicious little devil tools. You're eating mostly with your hands, or maybe with a shared spoon if you're fancy. And yet, the etiquette is stricter than a royal ceremony. You couldn't just reach for food. You had to use 3 fingers, not all 5, because using your full hand made you look like a starving bear. You were supposed to tear bread with your fingers, not bite into it directly. You were to drink quietly, no slurping, and definitely no gulping. If you sneezed, you covered your mouth, not with your hand, but with your sleeve. Yes, the same sleeve you wiped your mouth with. Hygiene was a journey, and if someone offered you food, you were to refuse at least once to show humility. Accepting too quickly made you look greedy. Refuse twice, though, and you were rude. So the sweet spot was one polite no, followed by a grateful, well, if you insist. Even where you sat mattered. High tables were reserved for nobles. Guests of lower rank sat farther down the hall, where the food was colder and the conversation less divine. It's literally where the phrase below the salt comes from. The important people sat near the big salt dish in the center, while the rest of you seasoned yourselves with humility. But why all this rigidity? Because eating wasn't just physical, it was moral. How you behaved at the table reflected the state of your soul. If you could restrain your appetite and your elbows, maybe, just maybe, you could also restrain your sins. Medieval dinner wasn't about pleasure, it was about practice. A rehearsal for heaven, married by geography, politics, and accident. Let's glide into another sacred mess. Marriage. The church, of course, had opinions. Marriage was holy and a sacrament blessed by God. But the rules, they were confusing enough to make anyone accidentally marry their cousin, which, to be fair, happened constantly. By the 12th century, the church had outlawed marriage between anyone related within 7 degrees of kinship. That sounds reasonable, until you realize 7 degrees included everyone from your cousin to your cousin's 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 husband's sister. In a small medieval village, that meant basically everyone. So to find a legal spouse, you had to map your entire family tree back to Adam, and since record-keeping was patchy, the solution was often just not to ask too many questions. Even royals got tangled in this. King John of England had to get papal permission to marry because his intended bride was too closely related. Spanish and Austrian monarchs eventually gave up entirely and just embraced inbreeding like it was a family hobby. And yes, that's how you get a Habsburg jawline so wide it deserves its own duchy. The rules were meant to prevent dynastic power grabs and preserve moral order. Instead, they created decades of annulments, papal bribes, and technically we didn't know we were cousins excuses. But it's the logic that's fascinating. In a world where every alliance was political, the Church wanted to remind everyone that marriage wasn't just strategy, it was sacred. And the easiest way to make something sacred, make it impossible to understand. Royal etiquette, how to bow without dying. If ordinary manners were strict, royal ones were practically acrobatic. Every movement had meaning. Every bow, every glance, every incorrectly folded cloak could be a career-ending offense. At the French court, you couldn't turn your back on the king, literally. You had to walk backward out of the room, maintaining eye contact like it was a weird staring contest with divine authority. If you tripped, you just pretended it didn't happen, because the only thing worse than disrespect was acknowledging human clumsiness in the presence of royalty. You also couldn't speak first, sit first, or even breathe too audibly while the monarch was eating. In Spain's court under Philip II, courtiers were forbidden from smiling during formal meals, because apparently joy was unseemly in proximity to divinely ordained power. But again, it wasn't just vanity. These rules turned chaos into choreography. They made hierarchy visible, physical, performable. In a society obsessed with divine order, etiquette was theology with better tailoring. And besides, imagine being the poor noble whose only job was to hold the royal napkin. You'd need rules too, just to make sense of your day. Sleeping with the saints, literally. Let's move to the night, the medieval world's quietest and strangest time. Sleeping wasn't private. Peasants often shared beds, not romantically, just because warmth was a team sport. Travelers bunked together at inns, sometimes with total strangers. Monks slept in dormitories, fully dressed, ready for midnight prayer bells. And if you were noble, you might have your own bed, but it was rarely empty. Courtiers, guards, pets, servants, someone was always there. Solitude was suspicious. There were also rules about how to sleep. You should fall asleep praying. You should face east, toward Jerusalem if possible. And you definitely shouldn't dream about anything impure, which of course meant everyone immediately did. People also slept in 2 shifts, first sleep and second sleep. After a few hours, they'd wake up around midnight, pray, talk quietly, or even visit their neighbors. Then a few hours later, they'd drift back into second sleep. It was less insomnia and more scheduled holiness. Even in rest, there was ritual. The night wasn't freedom. It was just another structured phase in the medieval 24-hour salvation cycle. Court trials, confessions, and cosmic drama. Now let's step into the courtroom, not the clean, modern kind, but the medieval version, which felt somewhere between a sermon and a carnival. Trials could be based on ordeals. You know, the God will decide method. If you were accused of theft, you might be told to grab a red-hot iron bar. If your hand healed nicely afterward, you were innocent. If not, well, divine justice had spoken. There was also trial by water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, congratulations. Innocent but very dead. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were based on a weirdly consistent theology. God controlled everything. So if he wanted you to live, he'd adjust the physics accordingly. It sounds absurd now, but in context it was a system of trust. People genuinely believed in divine fairness more than human judgment. And honestly, given the corruption levels of medieval officials, that might have been the more reliable option. The logic behind the lunacy. Every strange custom we've drifted through, every color code, every etiquette rule, every odd superstition had one thing in common. They made the world make sense. The medieval universe was terrifyingly uncertain. Plagues came out of nowhere. Kings died young, rain failed, children vanished into monasteries. God was silent but everywhere. So the rules, no matter how odd, gave shape to chaos. They were little acts of control, disguised as manners, morality, and order. And maybe that's why we still find them so compelling, because deep down we haven't really changed. We still use rituals to keep anxiety at bay. We still make rules to feel safe. We still dress, eat, and sleep according to what our culture tells us is right. The Middle Ages just did it with more incense and slightly worse plumbing. Hey guys, welcome back to the quiet end of the Middle Ages, where the human body was a moral project, the soul was a constant work in progress, and doctors sometimes prescribed roasted hedgehog for coughs. Tonight, we'll wander through the strange and sacred rules that governed health, healing, and holiness. Because in the medieval world, your body wasn't really yours. It was property of God, the church, and, if you were unlucky, your local barber. So get comfortable. We're about to open the most confusing first aid manual ever written. How to heal the soul by bleeding the body. Medicine in the Middle Ages was equal parts astrology, theology, and educated guessing. Doctors believed the body was controlled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you got sick, it was because one of these had gone rogue. Maybe your blood was too hot or your phlegm was feeling dramatic. The cure? Balance. And by balance they meant leeching. Bleeding was the universal solution. Fevers, headaches, heartbreak. Third didn't matter. If something hurt, they opened a vein. It was the medieval version of, have you tried turning it off and on again? But it wasn't chaos. There were rules. Doctors had entire charts telling them when and where to bleed someone. Don't bleed on a Sunday, too holy. Avoid doing it under certain constellations. And never ever bleed from the left arm during Lent. That was considered spiritually risky. Hospitals followed strict codes too. Patients were expected to confess their sins before treatment, because healing the body meant nothing if your soul was still messy. Nurses, often monks or nuns, worked in silence, rotating between prayer, poultices, and chanting. Each task had a rhythm, like liturgy, medicine as devotion. And though it sounds brutal now, there was comfort in the structure. You didn't just suffer, you suffered correctly. It gave pain a purpose. It made illness part of the grand moral design. Cleanliness next to godliness eventually. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people didn't all live in filth. They just had different ideas about what clean meant. Bathhouses were common in early medieval towns. People soaked, scrubbed, and gossiped. But as time went on, the church started side-eyeing public bathing. Too much nudity, too much temptation, too much fun. So gradually washing the soul took priority over washing the skin. Instead of baths, people relied on linen. Constantly changing shirts and undergarments was considered cleansing. Since the fabric absorbed impurities, it's basically medieval dry cleaning by proxy. Monks had rules about this too. Some were only allowed to bathe 3 times a year, Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, unless they were seriously ill. Because apparently, holiness required mild discomfort and an interesting smell. But again, there was logic behind it. Water wasn't always clean. Bathing too much could spread infection. So moderation wasn't just moral, it was survival. As usual, sin and sanitation ended up holding hands. Relics, when saints went global. If the body could be holy, then death didn't end its usefulness. Which brings us to relics, the medieval version of celebrity merch. Relics were physical remains of saints, bones, teeth, locks of hair, even entire heads. Churches competed fiercely to acquire them. The more relics you had, the more visitors you got. More visitors meant more donations. So yes, it was also a booming economy and sanctified body parts. Pilgrims traveled across continents just to glimpse a saint's finger bone. And because verification was impossible, some relics got creative. Multiple churches claimed to have the same saint's skull. At one point, there were enough fragments of the true cross in Europe to build a decent fishing boat. Still, relics offered structure in a chaotic world. They turned faith into something tangible. Touch the relic and you touched holiness. It was the medieval version of clicking accept cookies on salvation. Of course, it wasn't just about faith, it was also civic pride. Owning St. Catherine's finger meant your town mattered. It made the divine local. And even though half the relics were probably mislabeled bones from someone's unfortunate uncle, the emotion behind them was real. Belief was the relic that mattered most. Diagnosing the soul through urine. If you ever think your doctor today is weird, remember that medieval physicians routinely analyzed urine. They'd hold the flask up to the light, swirl it, sniff it, and confidently declare your fate. The color, the smell, the bubbles, each had a spiritual and medical meaning. Pale yellow, you're fine. Cloudy red, maybe fever. Dark and thick, definitely divine punishment. There were even illustrated urine charts, full-color wheels showing every possible shade and its meaning. Think of it as medieval Photoshop for diagnostics. The process wasn't just pseudoscience, it was ritual. Doctors were trained to read the human body like scripture. Each symptom was a sign, each sign a message from God. Medicine wasn't about conquering disease. It was about interpreting it, and honestly, that's kind of poetic. Every ache, every fever, not random but meaningful. A language between body and heaven, translated through amber liquid in a glass bottle. Burial, because heaven has a dress code. Even dying had rules, and especially dying properly. You had to confess, receive last rites, and ideally die facing east. If you died unconfessed or outside church grounds, things got complicated. Some cemeteries had literal boundaries marking where good deaths ended and bad deaths began. Suicides, criminals, and excommunicated folks were buried outside the fence, symbolically beyond grace. Your grave clothes mattered too. Simple linen if you were humble, elaborate robes if you were noble. Though many left instructions to be buried simply, just to show off their humility. And of course, relics and charms often went into the coffin. A saint's medal, a lock of a child's hair, a scrap of parchment with a prayer, small talismans against eternal uncertainty. Because the medieval afterlife wasn't comforting, it was bureaucratic. There were waiting rooms, purgatory, paperwork, indulgences, and a final audit on Judgment Day. So naturally, people spent their lives preparing their case file. Doctors, priests, and the spiritual bureaucracy of suffering. What ties all of this together? The bloodletting. The relics, the confession, the washing rules, is one strange, beautiful principle. The body was never separate from the soul. To heal one, you had to tend the other. To touch one, you needed permission from God. Every pain was both physical and moral. Every cure was a collaboration between herbs, prayers, and divine will. It wasn't science or faith, it was both, constantly overlapping. A fragile balance between medicine and miracle. And for all its absurdity, it gave people meaning. When your world is unpredictable, a bad diagnosis can feel almost merciful. At least it explains the suffering. And in the quiet of medieval hospitals, with their stone walls, soft chanting, and oil lamps flickering against frescoed saints, you can almost imagine how comforting that structure was. It didn't cure much, but it made sense, and that in the end might have been its own kind of healing. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you already know that the medieval world wasn't built on logic. It was built on structure. Everything had a rule, a hierarchy, a proper order of being. And nowhere was that more painfully, hilariously obvious than when it came to the human heart. Because yes, the Middle Ages had official rules for sinning. There were lists, categories, even recommended punishments, all lovingly recorded by men who apparently had a lot of free time and zero romantic experience. So tonight, we'll take a gentle walk through the moral instruction manual of the medieval soul, where everything from lust to laughter had a price tag. The 7 Deadlies, Medieval Mood Board. Everyone's heard of the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. But in the medieval world, these weren't just abstract concepts. They were practically diagnostic tools, like emotional spreadsheets for your conscience. Each sin had symptoms, opposites, and suggested remedies. Try to practice humility, gluttony, fast, wrath, take a walk, pray, and maybe avoid social gatherings for a while. It was an emotional self-help system. Centuries before self-help became profitable, confessors carried pocket guides listing sins and countermeasures. Some even had flowcharts. If you did this, do that. Because in a world where salvation was uncertain, you needed paperwork. It wasn't about crushing joy, it was about maintaining cosmic balance. They saw sin the way modern people see germs: invisible, contagious, and totally manageable with the right hygiene routine. The official church position on everything. Let's float over to the topic medieval theologians really loved to micromanage: intimacy. Because if there was one thing the church couldn't resist, it was making ordinary human behavior sound like an administrative offense. By the 13th century, confession manuals got incredibly specific. Like disturbingly specific. There were instructions for confessors about what questions to ask married couples, which, frankly, sound like rejected stand-up material. And it turns out, there were rules for everything. How often, when, where, why. Certain days were off limits. Advent, Lent, Sundays, feast days, the eve of feast days, and honestly most of the calendar. Certain positions were forbidden. Certain times of life were forbidden. Certain intentions were forbidden. Basically, the church looked at love and said, okay, but maybe try not enjoying it. It wasn't that they hated marriage. They actually valued it highly, as long as it stayed sacred and functional. But pleasure was suspicious. Anything that felt too good might distract you from contemplating eternity. There's even a famous 12th century list that ranked sexual acts by severity. Top-tier sins included adultery and anything unnatural, which, according to the church, was basically everything except missionary. Because apparently, that was the only position compatible with the Holy Spirit and correct furniture alignment. Yet again, there was logic under the madness. The church wasn't just being nosy. It was trying to protect lineage, inheritance, and social order. In a world without contraception or reliable record-keeping, moral policing was population control. So yes, the medieval priest in your village might ask inappropriate questions, but somewhere deep down he thought he was holding civilization together. Sin has a price tag, and it's on sale. Once confession became a regular thing, another rule-based system evolved: indulgences. The idea was simple: sin leaves behind spiritual debt. Do penance and you can work it off. Give to the poor, say extra prayers, maybe go on pilgrimage. But over time, someone had the brilliant idea to streamline the process. Why not just donate instead? And just like that, salvation became fully monetized. Indulgence lists started circulating, a kind of celestial price chart. 1 coin for minor sins, larger sums for major ones. There were even bulk forgiveness options for groups or guilds. In some towns you could buy indulgence coupons, actual slips of parchment guaranteeing a reduction in purgatory time. It sounds ridiculous now, but again it made sense to them. If salvation was measurable, then so was mercy. And in a world of constant uncertainty, that kind of clarity was intoxicating. It wasn't cynicism, and it was hope. A way to make divine justice feel like something you could negotiate. Hell, the ultimate bureaucracy. Hell in medieval imagination wasn't chaos. It was paperwork. Writers described it like a nightmarish legal office, full of demons filing endless complaints about human souls. Every sin had a punishment, meticulously catalogued in Dante's Inferno, which honestly reads like an early HR manual for eternal suffering. Each layer of hell corresponded to a specific offense. Gluttons wallowed in mud. The greedy hoarded stones. The wrathful fought forever. It wasn't about gore, it was about cosmic symmetry. You broke moral order. You got poetic justice, simple, predictable, comforting in a dark way. Because at least in hell things made sense. The rules worked. Every act had a consequence. A balance sheet for eternity. In that way, medieval theology wasn't cruel. It was profoundly administrative. They just happened to run their moral universe like a celestial tax office. Superstition's the people's rulebook. Of course, not everyone could read theology, or afford indulgences, or follow church Latin. So the rest of Europe made do with something even better, folk superstition, and these came with their own rule sets. Don't cut your nails on a Sunday. Don't sweep at night. It drives away good spirits. If you spill salt, toss some over your shoulder to blind the devil. If a black cat crosses your path, change direction. Every act had potential spiritual consequences. Every habit was a mini theology. And people believed because it worked, not magically but psychologically. It gave them a feeling of control. In a world without antibiotics or weather forecasts, control was everything. Superstition was just folk logic. If disease, famine, or heartbreak struck, at least you had reasons. And if you followed the unwritten rules, maybe you'd tip fortune back in your favor. It's not so different from modern rituals. Lucky socks, horoscope warnings, crossing fingers before big news. We just replace saints with algorithms. The confession booth, medieval therapy. Confession wasn't only about sin. It was also the closest thing most people had to therapy. You could talk. Someone would listen. And when you left, you felt lighter. Priests recorded astonishingly detailed accounts of people's struggles, guilt, temptation, anger, loneliness. It was the psychology of the soul before psychology existed, and the church understood that ritual was half the cure. Say your sins, hear forgiveness. Perform a small task to prove your sincerity. The human brain loves closure, and confession delivered it weekly. Behind the incense and guilt, there was compassion. The idea that everyone fails, but everyone can begin again. A strangely gentle truth buried under layers of rule-following. Temptation, dreams, and the problem of thoughts. Medieval theology took mental health very literally. If you had a bad thought, it wasn't just a thought and that it was a potential sin. The church called them temptations. Having them wasn't sinful, but enjoying them was. So naturally, everyone walked around panicking about their own brains. Monks wrote entire treatises about intrusive thoughts, lustful dreams, and unwanted impulses. Some described nighttime temptations as demonic assaults, literal spiritual attacks during sleep. Modern psychology might call it repression or anxiety, but they called it spiritual warfare, and to their credit they developed coping techniques, prayer routines, mindfulness-style repetition, even early forms of journaling. It wasn't science, but it helped. And sometimes that's all structure is supposed to do. Give shape to the chaos inside. Every sin weighs something. By the late Middle Ages, theologians started treating morality like physics. Every sin had weight. Every prayer had counterweight. Your soul was a scale. Angels on one side, demons on the other. Every small act tipped the balance. Artists even painted it that way. St. Michael holding scales, weighing human hearts. It was hauntingly beautiful and perfectly medieval. A universe that could be measured, counted, and balanced, even in matters of eternity. No one wanted to fall forever. But no one wanted chaos either. So they invented systems that made the infinite manageable. Rules that turned divine mystery into something you could chart with ink and parchment. The quiet genius of it all. It's easy to laugh at these rules now and the endless lists. The purity charts, the obsession with sin geometry. But the truth is, they were trying to understand something we still can't. How to live meaningfully in a world that makes no sense. Every sin list, every superstition, every confession was an attempt to find order in uncertainty. To make life moral, predictable, safe. To make death feel less final. And maybe that's the real miracle of the Middle Ages. Not the relics or the cathedrals, but the human instinct to create meaning out of confusion. Hey guys, welcome back. If your tea's gone cold by now, well, that's fine. Medieval people would have called that temperance. Tonight, we're gliding into the final centuries of the Middle Ages, a time when all those rules we've talked about started to crumble under their own weight. Europe, around the 14th and 15th centuries, was basically a slow-motion identity crisis. For hundreds of years, people had lived inside the same mental architecture. Church at the top, kings and nobles in the middle, peasants at the bottom, and God hovering over everyone like an invisible auditor. But cracks were forming. The rules weren't working like they used to. And the world, quite literally, was falling apart. When the world itself went wrong, let's start with something that broke everyone's faith in rules. The Black Death. Around 1347, ships came into European ports carrying rats. And those rats carried fleas, and those fleas carried plague. Within a few years, a third of Europe was gone. It was horrifying, yes, but also philosophically inconvenient, because according to medieval rules, everything bad had a reason. Famine, punishment. Floods, divine warning. Plague, well, that was supposed to fit too. But the problem was the plague didn't care about morality. It killed priests, nobles, sinners, saints, everyone. It was moral chaos. The church had no answer. And when the priests started dying faster than they could bury people, the whole hierarchy wobbled. People started wondering quietly. Of course, if maybe the old system wasn't working. Maybe the rules weren't divine laws after all. Maybe they were just human guesses. And for a civilization that had built its identity on certainty, that realization was like pulling the thread on a very large sweater. The church loses its monopoly. The church had always been the moral GPS of medieval life. If you wanted to know right from wrong, you asked a priest. If you wanted to know the meaning of dreams, you asked a monk. If you wanted to get to heaven faster, you paid a fee. But after the plague, after corruption scandals, after repeated wars that looked suspiciously unholy, people began side-eyeing the whole operation. Indulgences, those paid get-out-of-purgatory cards, started to look less like salvation and more like medieval customer service gone wrong. Some clergy lived lavishly, throwing banquets while preaching poverty. Popes fought each other. At one point, there were 3 different men claiming to be the true pope, each excommunicating the other 2. That didn't exactly inspire confidence. And while the church was busy arguing about which pope had the better paperwork, ordinary people started experimenting with spirituality on their own terms. Mystics began popping up everywhere, lay people who said they experienced God directly, no priest required. Women like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen claimed visions that sounded poetic and strangely modern, that God was love, that the divine was gentle, that hell might be more metaphor than geography. The church tolerated some, silenced others, but the idea was out there. Faith didn't have to be micromanaged. It could be personal, emotional, free. A quiet rebellion born from exhaustion. The Renaissance, rebranding the human race. By the 15th century, Europe started to wake up from its theological hangover. The Black Death had emptied cities, but it also loosened social hierarchies. Labor was suddenly valuable. Merchants were getting rich. And education, long monopolized by monasteries, began trickling into secular hands. Enter the Renaissance, which was basically a massive medieval midlife crisis. People started reading old Greek and Roman texts again, and what they found there was unsettling, because those ancient writers had no interest in purgatory or indulgences. They talked about reason, logic, beauty, pleasure, things medieval theology had filed under dangerous. And so for the first time in centuries, Europe remembered that humans could think for themselves. That maybe the world was knowable without divine spreadsheets. That perhaps curiosity wasn't a sin. Scholars began calling this humanism, not because they suddenly stopped believing in God, but because they realized maybe humans had a role in understanding creation. It was the philosophical equivalent of growing up. Of course, the church tried to keep up, publishing revised doctrines, building grander cathedrals, hiring Michelangelo to paint ceilings so awe-inspiring they practically screamed divine truth in 4K. But quietly, beneath the frescoes, reason was blooming. The rule-breakers start writing. Let's float over to the scholars, the ones who, frankly, got tired of being told what was allowed to exist. One of the first cracks came from a man named William of Ockham, who basically invented intellectual minimalism. His idea was simple. Don't multiply explanations beyond necessity. Or as modern people might say, keep it simple. That's Occam's razor, a medieval idea that sliced through centuries of overcomplicated theology. He didn't mean to start a revolution, but once people realized they could explain the world without invoking angels and demons every 5 minutes, well, the floodgates opened. Then came people like Petrarch, who treated classical literature like spiritual treasure. He called the centuries after Rome's fall the Dark Ages, not because they were evil, but because they'd forgotten how to think. Which is fair, but also a bit rude to everyone who kept civilization alive in monasteries for 1,000 years. Still, that phrase stuck. Dark Ages. And the Renaissance sold itself as the light. It wasn't about rejecting God. It was about rewriting the user manual for existence. And in doing so, the old medieval rules about knowledge, emotion, sin, even beauty started dissolving. When heaven got smaller. Now, imagine living your entire life believing the earth was the calm, divine center of everything, and then someone comes along and says, actually, we're just spinning around a star. That's what Copernicus did. His heliocentric model of the universe was like philosophical dynamite. The cosmos had rules, sure, but they weren't our rules. They were mathematical, indifferent, elegant, and that terrified people. Suddenly, the universe didn't feel moral anymore. It felt mechanical, predictable, vast. And yet that was progress. The medieval idea of a clockmaker god, one who created the universe and set it ticking, came from this transition. It was a way to blend faith with reason, to say, okay, maybe the rules changed, but they're still divine, just less micromanaged. And honestly, that's the kind of compromise only a civilization halfway between prayer and physics could invent. The printing press, when ideas escaped the monastery. If one invention deserves blame for the end of the medieval rulebook, it's the printing press. Before that, books were handwritten, one at a time, by monks who sometimes added passive-aggressive notes in the margins like, "This ink is terrible. Pray for me." Then around 1440, Johannes Gutenberg shows up and says, "What if books didn't have to take 10 years to make?" And just like that, Europe got its first taste of viral content. Knowledge went public. Bibles, pamphlets, heretical manifestos, all mass-produced and distributed faster than the church could censor them. Ideas that used to belong to monks were suddenly being read by bakers, blacksmiths, and bored students. And once information became democratic, control was impossible. The printing press was basically the medieval internet, and just like the modern one, it was full of half-truths, propaganda, and the occasional genuine enlightenment. It changed everything, forever. Reformation, the rule book rewritten in real time. The 16th century came along, and by then everyone was fed up with the church's bureaucracy. Enter Martin Luther, a monk who finally snapped. He nailed 95 complaints and his famous theses to a church door in 1517, which was basically the medieval equivalent of a very long angry tweet. His main point? You can't buy your way into heaven. Faith is personal, not transactional. The church had overcomplicated salvation into a business model. People loved it. Printers copied his theses like wildfire. Suddenly, half of Europe was protesting indulgences, and the other half was defending them. Hence the word Protestant. And while wars and schisms followed, the bigger shift was psychological. Ordinary people started reading the Bible for themselves. No Latin, no priestly filter. Just personal interpretation. It was messy, chaotic, and full of new dogmas, but it was freedom. And it marked the end of the medieval mind's monopoly on truth. From obedience to curiosity, by the late 1500s, the European mindset had changed forever. People still believed in God, but now they also believed in questioning, experimenting, measuring. Science, philosophy, art, all of it was reborn. The old rule-based world, where every action had a cosmic manual, slowly gave way to something terrifying and beautiful. Uncertainty. Instead of memorizing divine patterns, people began to look for natural ones. The movement of planets, the anatomy of the human body, the laws of motion. Truth became observable, not just received, and yet something of the medieval spirit lingered, because deep down humans still craved order. They still wanted systems, explanations, lists, just written in a different language now. Physics replaced theology. Laboratories replaced confessionals. But the impulse was the same. Find meaning, write rules, make sense of the chaos. The quiet fade of the old world. By the time we reach the 17th century, the Middle Ages are officially over, though no one living then really called it that. The past doesn't end in real time. It just fades softly like a candle burning out. Cathedrals still stood, monks still chanted, peasants still prayed for good harvests. But in cities, new thinkers were dissecting cadavers, sketching anatomy, mapping stars, and arguing that maybe, just maybe, the universe didn't revolve around human morality at all. It wasn't a revolution with trumpets. It was a slow exhale after 1,000 years of holding its breath. The world didn't stop believing in rules. It just started writing new ones. Rules of science, rules of state, rules of individuality, and somewhere beneath it all, the medieval heart still whispered, still loved structure, mystery, and ritual, even as it drifted into the modern age. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived the longest moral rulebook in human history. From sin charts to celestial mechanics, we've glided through 1,000 years of order, logic, faith, and occasional absurdity. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake after 8 parts of moral accounting, congratulations. You've basically earned a medieval theology degree. But tonight, We're setting aside the popes and philosophers for something gentler. We're going under the rules. Beneath the parchment and the sermons there were people, farmers, midwives, bakers, blacksmiths, nuns, apprentices. Most of them couldn't read. Most of them never traveled more than 10 miles from home. But all of them lived inside the strange machinery of medieval life, trying to find small pieces of joy between plague years and church bells. And unlike the rulers and bishops, their rules were not written down. They were whispered, observed, inherited. This was the unspoken side of the Middle Ages, the quiet heartbeat of ordinary survival. So let's dim the torchlight, lean back, and listen to what medieval people actually felt, not just what they were told to feel. The rhythm of the ordinary day. If you were an average medieval villager, your day began long before sunrise. Not because you were an early riser, but because daylight was precious. You'd wake to the sound of animals, not alarms. A rooster, a cow, maybe the church bell if you lived near one. Breakfast wasn't really a concept, just a chunk of bread, maybe dipped in ale or weak broth. Then straight to work. Farmers tended to the fields, women spun wool or baked bread, children fetched water, everyone shared tools. Everything revolved around daylight. The workday wasn't measured in hours, but in natural signs. When the dew dried, when the sun was high, when the first bat appeared. And yet, for all the hardship, there was rhythm, comforting, repetitive rhythm. No emails, no schedules, just cycles, sunrise, prayer, work, meal, sunset, sleep. People complained, of course. There are surviving records of peasants grumbling about taxes, poor harvests, lazy neighbors, and bad weather. Some things truly never change, but in that repetition there was safety. Life was hard, but it made sense. Every task, every bell, every prayer told you who you were and what to do next. In a world of chaos, predictability was peace. The quiet joy of food, medieval food, gets a bad reputation, all gruel and grey meat. But it wasn't that bleak. Yes, the average peasant ate simply bread, onions, cabbage, beans. But bread was sacred. It wasn't just food. It was life, labor, and faith in one crusty loaf. People made the sign of the cross before cutting it. Some even apologized if they dropped a crumb. Beer or ale was safer than water, so everyone, even kids, drank it daily. Not to get drunk, though that happened plenty, but because water often came from rivers that doubled as laundry stations, and unfortunately, latrines. For the wealthy, food was another language entirely. They used spices like saffron and cinnamon as status symbols, edible jewelry. Banquets were opportunities to show off not just wealth, but imagination. One recorded feast included a roasted peacock, feathers reattached, served flaming. But for most people, a good meal was humble and emotional. A rare piece of cheese, a handful of berries, a feast day meat stew. The world was small, but the moments of pleasure were huge. Sleep was a journey. Medieval people didn't sleep like us. They had what historians call segmented sleep. They'd go to bed after sunset, wake around midnight, pray, think, or talk quietly in the dark, then fall asleep again until dawn. That middle-of-the-night interval, called the watch, was considered normal. Some wrote that it was a sacred time, perfect for reflection or quiet conversation. Others used it for less holy activities, like visiting neighbors or sneaking out for secret trysts. In a way, it was the medieval equivalent of 2 a.m. thoughts, that liminal time where your brain wanders unguarded. People used it to think about dreams, sins, regrets, or plans. And those dreams, they took them seriously. Dreams were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from demons, sometimes from indigestion. Medieval dream books circulated widely, offering translations. If you dreamed of falling, it meant pride. If you dreamed of running water, it meant temptation. If you dreamed of fire, it meant passion. or maybe bad cheese. It's funny, but it also shows something beautiful. People wanted meaning in everything, even their sleep. They couldn't bear the idea that the mind might be random. Every image had to connect to something bigger. Fear was a constant companion. For all their rules, medieval people lived with an undercurrent of fear. Fear of sin, yes, but also of things we'd call superstition today. Bad luck was a serious concern. If your cow got sick, it wasn't bad genetics, it was the evil eye. If your child fell ill, it wasn't infection, it was witchcraft or divine punishment. And so people filled their lives with tiny rituals. They wore amulets, bits of bone, ribbon, or saint medallions to ward off illness. They whispered blessings over bread. They knocked on wood, long before it became a cliché. Every object carried meaning. Keys, shoes, mirrors, all potential conduits of luck or doom. At night, fear deepened. The medieval world was dark in ways we can't imagine now. No streetlights, no steady glow on the horizon. When the sun went down, so did the safe world. Wolves howled. Bats flitted. Shadows turned into omens. That's why so many prayers were written for night protection. The world after sunset felt porous, like the boundary between life and spirit had thinned. What they talked about, contrary to the dusty stereotype, medieval people weren't silent or joyless. They gossiped constantly. Village squares, markets, taverns, and churchyards were hubs of conversation, and rumor was its own economy. Court records reveal villagers testifying about who insulted whom, who stole whose chicken, and who danced too provocatively at midsummer. Because yes, even in the 13th century, people were scandalized by bad dancing. In taverns, people sang bawdy songs, told crude jokes, and debated local gossip. Who was sleeping with whom, which lord raised taxes, which saints' relics were fake. Language was colorful, blunt, and deeply regional. A peasant from northern England might not understand one from southern France. Latin was for priests. Dialect was for everyone else, and humor, though coarse, there was constant. There's a surviving 14th century poem complaining that monks were lazy and that women talked too much. So basically, medieval satire was identical to Twitter. Love, lust, and the weird romance rules. Ah, yes, love. The one subject medieval rule-makers could never quite control. Courtly love, that romantic ideal of knights pining for unattainable ladies, wasn't reality. It was literature, but it bled into behavior anyway. Young nobles wrote poetry about unfulfilled desire. Peasants, meanwhile, had their own rules, a mix of church regulation and local custom. Marriage wasn't primarily about passion. It was about property, alliances, and community stability. But love sneaked in anyway. There are letters from medieval wives teasing their husbands. Husbands writing to wives with genuine tenderness. One French peasant woman left behind a note that said, "My heart is yours, though I must churn the butter." Simple, practical, and sweet. And yes, people cheated. People flirted. People got caught. There were even love courts in some regions, where women judged cases of broken promises or bad romance etiquette. Imagine Judge Judy, but everyone's in chainmail. The church frowned on sex outside marriage, but that didn't stop anyone. Brothels were licensed in many towns, a bizarre but practical public health policy. Better to regulate desire than pretend it didn't exist. In the end, love, like everything else, had its rules. But real emotion slipped through anyway. And that's the story of humanity right there. Religion, but personal. For all the pomp of the church, personal spirituality was surprisingly intimate. Ordinary people didn't always grasp Latin prayers, but they made their own versions, small. Homemade faiths stitched together from ritual, folklore, and hope. They prayed to local saints for toothaches, weather, lost cows. They left wax figures at shrines, offered bread to holy wells, whispered petitions into tree hollows. And they believed deeply, not out of fear, but because faith gave shape to uncertainty. When everything could go wrong, belief was a form of control. Pilgrimage was a kind of medieval therapy. Walk hundreds of miles, see new places, meet strangers, feel closer to something eternal. The physical act of walking, of moving your body toward grace, mattered as much as the destination. It's easy to call it superstition, but in truth it was mindfulness. Every prayer bead was a heartbeat, every ritual a moment of calm. Death was always nearby. Medieval people were not morbid. They were realistic. Death was constant. Infant mortality, plague, war, famine. Everyone lost someone. But rather than avoiding it, they made peace with it. They prayed for a good death, one with confession, last rites, and family nearby. They decorated their homes with memento mori, small reminders of mortality, skull carvings, hourglasses, wilted flowers. It wasn't macabre. It was grounding. To remember death was to remember life. Funerals were community events. Bell ringing, processions, shared meals. Children attended too, because death wasn't hidden. It was part of the rhythm. There's something oddly comforting in that honesty. They didn't chase immortality. They just tried to die well and be remembered kindly, dreaming the future. Finally, we come to dreams again, because for medieval people, dreams weren't just nighttime nonsense. They were tiny windows into the divine. People dreamed of saints, of ancestors, of omens. Dream interpretation was both art and theology. Kings kept dream interpreters at court. Peasants told their dreams to confessors. Everyone wanted to believe that sleep was communication, that God or fate or something was whispering clues. Some dreams were comforting, others terrifying. But either way, they were seen as proof that the invisible world was near. And in a strange way, that belief made the medieval world less lonely. Because if every dream meant something, then no one ever truly slept alone. The human core beneath the rules. So when we strip away the rules, the rituals, the saints and the sins, what's left? People. People who wanted love, who feared loss, who looked for patterns in the sky and in their own hearts, who told stories to make the dark less terrifying, who prayed not for perfection, but for peace. And maybe that's the most enduring rule of all, that no matter the century, we are always just trying to make sense of being alive. Welcome back to the morally confused Middle Ages. Hey guys, tonight we're getting comfortable with one of the weirdest corners of medieval society, where every human urge had a footnote, every sin had a price, and every superstition had at least one saint ready to deal with it. This is where faith met fear, where people prayed for rain, but also buried toads to make sure it worked, where priests lectured about chastity, then wrote entire handbooks cataloging every possible sin of the flesh, in disturbingly detailed Latin. So take a deep breath, pour yourself some imaginary mead, and let's float gently into the anxious, rule-filled heart of the Middle Ages, where everyone was guilty, and the church was basically the medieval version of tech support for the soul. The business of sin. Let's start with one of the strangest systems ever invented, the moral economy of penance. The church, being the ultimate authority on sin, decided early on that not all sins were equal. Some were light, like gossiping, missing mass, or sneaking meat on a Friday. Others were heavy, murder, heresy, or doing anything interesting on a holy day. But here's the fun part. There were rules, handbooks, and price lists. You could literally look up your sin and see what it cost. Medieval confessors used manuals called penitentials, sort of like early customer service scripts for salvation. They'd flip through and find your offense. Stole a chicken? 3 days of fasting. had impure thoughts. 20 lashes or a donation to the poor. Slept with your cousin? Well, that's going to be complicated and expensive. If you had money, though, there was a shortcut. You could buy indulgences, spiritual coupons that reduced your time in purgatory. Over time, this turned into a massive religious economy. You sinned, confessed, paid, and carried on. It wasn't exactly forgiveness, more like a divine subscription plan. And honestly, it kind of made sense. Everyone sinned. So rather than live in constant terror, the church just made the process bureaucratic. Spiritual guilt became something you could manage, efficient, transactional, comfortably predictable, because in a world where everything, famine, plague, childbirth, could kill you, people needed one thing they could control, their paperwork for heaven. Chastity, technically. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite forbidden topic. Sex. Medieval moral rules around it were, well, elaborate. The church's goal wasn't just to stop people from misbehaving. It was to make sure even the permissible parts happened correctly. Marriage was the only acceptable outlet, and even that came with a user manual. There were entire calendars marking which days you couldn't have sex. During Lent, forbidden. Sundays, forbidden. Feast days, holy days, or if there was an eclipse, also forbidden. By some estimates, nearly 40% of the year was off limits. That's right. Nearly half your marriage existed in a perpetual try-again-later mode. And of course there were positional preferences. Missionary was approved. Anything else was considered unnatural. Because if you're going to sin by enjoying yourself, at least do it politely. The obsession with chastity was never really about purity. It was about order. Desire made people unpredictable. And medieval society loved predictability more than happiness. Monks, nuns, priests, all sworn to celibacy, were expected to channel passion into prayer. And when they failed, which was often, the church turned a blind eye, unless it got messy. Some monasteries became quiet hubs of gossip and scandal. Some abbots fathered children and then baptized them themselves, which is about as awkward as it sounds. Still, even that chaos was governed by rules. Confess, repent, pay, repeat. Human weakness was predictable, and therefore manageable. Superstition, the official, unofficial religion. While priests lectured about proper piety, regular people filled the gaps with their own local magic. To us, superstition sounds irrational, but to them it was just another layer of divine logic. If the church didn't have an answer, your grandmother's charms probably did. Need to protect your crops? Hang a dead weasel by the barn. To stop a fever? Tie a frog to your neck until it dies. And yes, people genuinely did that, because apparently that's how medieval detox worked. Women especially were the keepers of these household rituals. Midwives, herbalists, wise women, all walking the line between medicine and witchcraft. Most of them weren't persecuted, though. Not yet, that came later. For most of the Middle Ages, people simply accepted that the sacred and the supernatural were roommates. Even priests used amulets. Monks scribbled protective charms in the margins of prayer books. And travelers carried tiny lead crosses to ward off demons, bad luck, and suspicious-looking cats. The church publicly frowned on superstition, but privately tolerated it. After all, it worked, at least sometimes, because when your world is ruled by storms, disease, and random violence, believing in a frog necklace feels oddly comforting. It gave people something to do, some way to nudge fate in their favor. Faith handled the soul. Superstition handled the daily chaos. Heaven's accounting department. By the late Middle Ages, Christianity had turned salvation into a kind of celestial bureaucracy. There were mortal sins, venial sins, indulgences, relics, penances, each with assigned values and time credits. Heaven, it seemed, ran on paperwork, Monks literally copied ledgers listing how many prayers, pilgrimages, or donations could shave off years in purgatory. You could earn 300 days of grace for reciting certain psalms, or 500 if you visited a specific shrine. The numbers weren't symbolic, they were exact. It sounds absurd, but it brought comfort. Salvation was scary. The afterlife was infinite. So having a chart felt reassuring. Do enough, pray enough, pay enough, and you could mathematically improve your odds. It's easy to laugh, but let's be honest, we still love systems that promise control. Theirs just happened to involve incense and parchment instead of spreadsheets and apps. When faith got a bit too creative. By the 13th century, superstition and piety had fused into something wonderfully bizarre. People collected holy water like it was perfume. They wore tiny reliquaries around their necks, some containing saintly dust, others containing things that were definitely not saintly dust. There were rules about crossing yourself too. Do it too fast and it looked irreverent. Do it too slow, and people thought you were showing off. Monks debated whether angels could move through solid walls. Scholars argued about whether a mouse that ate consecrated bread became holy by digestion. That's a real medieval theological debate, by the way. The consensus? No, the mouse did not become divine, but it was still very rude. Every act, every thought was categorized, analyzed, moralized, and somehow people found comfort in the absurdity. Because life was chaos and a war, famine, plague, taxes, and all these rules made it feel just a little bit less random. The quiet logic of obsession. It's easy for us to look back and laugh at all this. The frogs, the relics, the calendars of forbidden intimacy. But the truth is, these people weren't stupid. They were terrified and trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense. When your crops fail, when half your children die before 10, when the Black Death rolls through without explanation, you make rules. You measure morality like medicine. You categorize sin like disease. Because if you can name something, maybe you can control it. We still do it today, just with different rituals. Our superstitions are digital now. Our indulgences are likes, views, and virtue signals. We still build systems to feel less helpless. The Middle Ages just made theirs smell like incense, and so, as the bells of Vespers echo over some forgotten abbey, we can imagine a world half asleep, monks whispering prayers, peasants counting sins, candles flickering beside a bowl of holy water, and a dead toad. It's ridiculous. It's beautiful. It's so deeply human. Welcome back, time travelers, but very, very slow ones. Hey guys. Tonight we're slowing things down, even by medieval standards. See, the Middle Ages didn't just have rules for food, sin, and bathing. They had rules for time itself. When to wake, when to pray, when to eat, when to stop eating because it was Friday and you forgot the fish. It's weird to think about, but for most of human history, time wasn't something people had. It was something that happened to them. There were no ticking clocks, no appointments, no buzzing phones reminding you to stretch. Instead, people lived by natural rhythms: sunrise, sunset, bells, and boredom. Lots of boredom, because before the industrial age turned time into money, time was mostly empty, and people filled that emptiness with prayer, ritual, and rules. So, let's drift into that slow world for a while, where hours were prayers, calendars were moral contracts, and sleep came in two gentle waves. When bells ruled the world. If you were alive in the Middle Ages, your life was run by bells, not metaphorically, literally. Every monastery, every town church, every cathedral tower was a timekeeper. The bells didn't just tell you the hour. They told you what to do: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, 7 daily prayers. 7 points in the day when life stopped, And the monks sang. Even if you weren't a monk, you still lived by those rhythms. The bells marked when markets opened, when fields should be ploughed, when curfews began, when doors locked. Time wasn't measured, it was rung. And because mechanical clocks didn't really exist until the 1300s, bells were the closest thing to public timekeeping. But they weren't precise. One abbey's noon might be another's late morning-ish, it didn't matter. Precision wasn't the goal, harmony was. The point wasn't to control the hour, it was to feel aligned with divine rhythm. The bell didn't tell you what time it was. It told you that you were part of something eternal. Even the peasants in the fields could hear it echoing across valleys, the slow, reassuring sound of order. No watches, no deadlines, just the slow breathing of a world that didn't hurry, sleeping twice the forgotten night. Here's a fun, deeply relaxing fact. Medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. They had two sleeps. The first sleep happened after dusk. People went to bed early. Candles were expensive and darkness was terrifying. So they slept for about 4 hours. Then around midnight they woke up naturally, no alarm needed, and stayed awake for an hour or two. This was the quiet time. They called it the watch. It was a peaceful in-between, half waking, half dreaming. People prayed, read, stoked the fire, talked softly, or even visited neighbors. It wasn't considered weird to drop by for a midnight chat. It was just what people did. Then came the second sleep, lasting until dawn. This two-part rhythm matched the pace of a world without electricity or caffeine. And it made sense. Nights were long. Lives were slow, and there was no reason to force continuous sleep. Doctors even wrote about it, calling the period between sleeps the most serene time of the day for contemplation. Imagine that insomnia wasn't a disorder. It was a built-in pause, a time to think, to pray, to whisper, to exist in the gentle space between fatigue and rest. If there's anything modern life could learn from the medieval world, it's that. They may not have had Netflix, but they mastered the art of doing nothing beautifully. The calendar of control. Let's talk about the most controlling invention in medieval life, the church calendar. It wasn't just a schedule of holy days, it was the schedule. Every day had a saint. Every month had a fast, a feast, or a festival. You didn't just wake up and decide what to do. The calendar decided for you, and this wasn't just spiritual micromanagement. It kept society stable. If you knew Lent was coming, you could plan your grain stores. If the feast of St. John was near, you knew it was midsummer and time to harvest herbs. The church basically turned religion into a giant, moral weather forecast, and it worked. People didn't need planners. They just needed to remember whether it was a meat day, a fish day, or a no-food-at-all day. Even farmers timed their labor by the saints. Plough on St. Martin's Day, shear on St. John's Eve, pray for rain on St. Swithin's. It wasn't superstition. It was the only shared clock the world had, and because everyone followed it, time itself became sacred. The past, present, and future blurred into a single repeating rhythm of faith and fatigue. Every year was a loop, like breathing. Exhale the sins of winter. Inhale the blessings of spring. Time didn't march forward. It circled. It spiraled gently, predictably. It never rushed. Monastic time, the original work schedule. If the bells ruled the world, the monasteries were the clockmakers. Monks lived in one of the most structured environments imaginable. Every moment of their day, even silence, was regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, dictated almost everything. When to pray, when to eat, when to read, when to sweep, when to be silent about how much you hated sweeping. They woke before dawn for matins, chanting in near darkness. They prayed again at sunrise, again at mid-morning, again at noon, again at evening. In between, they farmed, copied manuscripts, or slept, but always within the clockwork rhythm of devotion. It sounds suffocating, but for many it was deeply peaceful. There was freedom in the lack of choice. You didn't have to decide what to do next. Time itself carried you forward. And the monasteries weren't just spiritual centers. They were the first places to develop mechanical clocks. Because let's face it, even monks got tired of waiting for someone to ring the bell at the wrong time. By the 14th century, massive iron clocks began appearing in abbey towers. Slow, heavy and imprecise, but revolutionary. They didn't just tell time. They made time real. From then on, the world slowly began ticking. The birth of boredom. The Middle Ages weren't exciting, at least not in the daily sense. For most people, life moved at a crawl. Seasons blending, tasks repeating, years indistinguishable. And oddly enough, that created the first real sense of boredom. Not the frantic modern kind, but a slow existential heaviness. They even had a word for it, acedia. Acedia was a kind of spiritual fatigue, especially common among monks. It was the feeling of staring at your prayer book and thinking, I've read this line about mercy 200 times today, and I still don't care. Theologians called it the noonday demon, a dangerous apathy that crept in during the quiet hours between duties. To fight it, monks were told to pray harder, work harder, meditate more, because of course the medieval solution to emotional exhaustion was more effort, but behind it was a deep truth. Humans struggle when time feels too still, and in a world without novelty, that stillness was endless. Every sunrise was the same, every bell the same tone, every day a repetition of yesterday. It was peaceful, yes, but also quietly suffocating. So they filled the silence with prayer, with structure, with ritual, because when time stretches too long, you have to anchor yourself to something. When clocks came for the soul. By the 14th century, things started to change. Cities grew louder. Merchants needed schedules. And time, that ancient sleepy rhythm, but began to accelerate. Clocks appeared in town squares. Gears replaced bells. The divine order gave way to mechanical order, and though nobody realized it at first, this changed everything. Once you could measure time precisely, you could waste it. And once you could waste it, you could feel guilty about not using it efficiently. Congratulations, you just invented modern anxiety. Medieval people had feared sin. We fear being unproductive. It's the same guilt in a different wrapper. So maybe the monks, for all their endless chanting, had the right idea after all. They didn't manage time, they inhabited it. They treated every hour as something to live through, not optimize. It wasn't about saving time, it was about letting time save you. The soft ending of time. So as we drift further into the night, imagine it again. A dark monastery on a hillside, fog rolling off the fields, bells echoing like slow heartbeats, a monk lighting candles, a peasant snoring near his hearth. Hey Mother whispering prayers between her two sleeps. The world moving gently, predictably, like clockwork without the clock. Time not as a weapon or a resource, but as a kind of lullaby. That's how the Middle Ages survived chaos. They didn't fight time, they sanctified it, and somehow that made even boredom feel holy.